Welcome to the Grade 11 Consumer Studies lesson. Today we'll be covering the topic food and nutrition. Food and nutrition is a vast topic, and I will be highlighting the subtopics that we'll be covering today. Here are the subtopics that we'll be covering today. Food contamination, cross-contamination, how to identify contaminated food, high-risk food, food poisoning symptoms, treating food poisoning, and lastly, control measures to prevent contamination. So, before we move on, let's do a quick recap. In grade 10 Consumer Studies, you went through food spoilage, food hygiene, and food safety. This is important to remember because most of the topics we are going to cover are a continuation of some of the grade 10 content. We will be going more into detail about food poisoning and how to identify contaminated food and what to do if someone ingests contaminated food. Please get your notes, your pens, and open your textbooks. Okay, so let us begin our lesson. Food contamination. What is food contamination? Food contamination is the presence of harmful chemical and microorganisms in food. Microorganisms could be viruses or bacteria that naturally grow in food. Chemicals could be soap, could be bleach, or even the chemicals that they use inside of canned food. Those chemicals can become toxic once the can is opened or if it falls down and cracks. Cross-contamination. Cross-contamination is the transfer of bacteria from one surface to another through contact, or the transfer of bacteria from one food item to another. This can happen by using a knife that you had used to cut raw uncooked chicken, and you use that very same knife to cut salad. What causes contamination? Contamination is caused by improper food storage. For example, when you store uncooked raw chicken next to cooked chicken or any cooked food item. Improper handling of food. By this, I mean you maybe take your chicken breast and put it on a plate where you had put red meat that was uncooked. So basically mixing two food items that you're not supposed to be mixing. Poor kitchen hygiene. Poor kitchen hygiene could be that you went to smoke and you came back and you touched food without washing your hands, or even wearing dirty clothes and then touching food. A dirty apron, or even not using gloves. There are three different types of contamination. There is chemical contamination, which could be soap, could be bleach, and again, as I mentioned above, could be the chemicals that they use inside of cans that become toxic once opened. Microbiological contamination. This is contamination through bacteria and viruses that is naturally in food. Viruses and bacteria such as Salmonella and E. coli. And lastly, physical contamination. Physical contamination could be broken glass in food or bones in a soup. How can you identify contaminated food? Contaminated food can be identified by 3 different ways, which is through smell. For example, fish will smell stronger than usual when it has been contaminated. Change in color. For example, raw uncooked red meat will turn brown. And lastly, change in texture. Raw chicken or even cooked chicken will become slimy when you touch it. Chemical contamination could be mostly identified by the smell of chemical in food, or maybe even you could see that it starts burning somewhere somehow. And physical contamination can be easily identified by seeing or touching. For example, bones in soup or glass in salad. These you can see by just looking. High-risk food. What is high-risk food? High-risk food is food that allows bacteria to grow faster and usually are highly perishable food items. For example, cooked rice. Cooked rice is a high-risk food because of the moisture present, and bacteria tends to grow faster when there is moisture, unlike uncooked rice because it is dry. Soup. Soup also is a high-risk food because there is moisture and different food items that end up making the soup. Fish. Because it is a protein, fish naturally has bacteria in it. So if it's not stored or handled properly, it becomes a high-risk food. Chicken, due to the presence of salmonella. And prawns. All these items are high-risk foods. So now that we have spoken about high-risk foods, what happens if you eat some of the high-risk food and it has been contaminated? You end up getting food poisoning. What is food poisoning? Food poisoning is when someone consumes food that has been contaminated by harmful microorganisms or chemicals, leading to an illness and sometimes death if left untreated. You can identify food poisoning by the following symptoms: diarrhea, cramps, vomiting, nausea, headache, weakness. Although you may experience other symptoms, but these are the most common food poisoning symptoms. Food poisoning should never be ignored and should be acted on fast. So now that we know how to identify when someone has food poisoning through the symptoms that they will be showing, we need to know how to treat food poisoning. Food poisoning can be treated or managed at home, but if symptoms last for more than 3 days or become worse, a doctor should be seen. Food poisoning can be treated or managed at home by drinking lemon ginger tea, drinking a lot of water to flush out the bacteria or virus or chemical. And once you've had experience food poisoning symptoms and they start going away, start by eating soft food and make sure that it is safe and not contaminated. And seek medical treatment once symptoms get worse. Medical treatment could be antibiotics or over-the-counter medication. To avoid food poisoning or contamination, we can take the following control measures. We can use correct, clean equipment and clean equipment after we use it. We need to wash knives, boards after cutting each food item, even though you are cutting it at around the same time. It does not matter. When you enter the kitchen or when you're touching food, wash the food and wash the food item. Sanitize the tables where you're going to be working on, because bacteria is present everywhere. And store food at the right and correct temperatures. For example, perishable food needs to be stored in the fridge, and the fridge temperature needs to be at around 5 degrees, from 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. And frozen food need to be at around -16 to -18 degrees Celsius. We are now to complete a class activity. The class activity is a quiz at the end of the notes, and you also have homework. The homework activity is designing an A3 size poster of food poisoning and how to treat it, and how to avoid cross-contamination and contamination altogether. Your poster needs to be colorful, neat, presentable, and it needs to include pictures or drawings. It is up to you whether you use pictures from magazines or you draw your own. You can even download pictures from the internet. I will close off by saying it is important to make sure that you store food properly and that you handle food properly and safely. You have learned the different ways in which you can do so. You also have learned the difference between contamination and cross-contamination, how to manage food poisoning at home, and when to see a doctor. You also learned about how to identify food poisoning symptoms, how to identify contaminated food, and what measures to take to avoid food spoilage or cross-contamination. And now we have come to the end of our lesson. Please keep your notes, as you might need them in grade 12, as food and nutrition is still covered in grade 12. Thank you.